Please take a moment and welcome our dear friend Brooke Hamilton to the NextGen stage.
Lost cause, weak. He just wasn't raised right. Can you not just quit already? These are the lies and the things that we say to individuals who are struggling with opioid addiction. My name is Brooke Hamilton, and for the last 2 years, I've had the privilege and honor to be a part of the litigation team representing the state of Oklahoma in its lawsuit against opioid manufacturers for mismarketing opioid drugs here in this state. And in fact, we are the first state in the entire country to receive a verdict against Big Pharma. Johnson & Johnson specifically, thank you. Johnson & Johnson specifically for causing a public nuisance here in this state. Now, over the last 2 years, I've had the privilege and the honor to learn from some of the leading experts in addiction prevention and medication and treatment, as well as hear the stories of individuals who have either struggled with opioid addiction or have had a loved one who has. And what I have learned is that addiction truly is a disease of the brain. However, unlike other illnesses such as cancer, there is a stigma of shame placed upon individuals who struggle with opioid addiction. So today, I plan to share with you 3 things that I hope will change your heart towards this subject as mine has. The first is, how did we get here? How is it in 2017 alone, almost the same number of people died from an opioid overdose as they did in the entirety of the Vietnam War? 2, the science behind addiction, how it truly is a disease of the brain, and how, like other illnesses such as cancer, there is just a stigma placed with it, and it's not just a character flaw, but someone even as good as Mother Teresa could become an addict. And lastly, how did we get here? And what we can do to set a new standard in how we treat those who are suffering from opioid addiction. So to my first point, how did we get here? Simple. A brilliant marketing campaign fueled by greed and deception. For centuries, people knew that opioids were a dangerous substance, and in fact, the United States experienced an opioid epidemic in the late 1800s. After that, this country, we started practicing what's called narcotic conservatism, and only prescribed opioids in situations such as end-of-life care and cancer treatment. However, all of this changed in 1996 with the introduction of something as small as a little white pill. In 1996, Purdue Pharmaceuticals launched OxyContin, a time-release formulation of oxycodone onto the market. And they marketed it differently. And instead of marketing it for something that was to be used for end-of-life care and cancer treatment, it was to be used for long-term chronic non-cancer pain. And this changed everything. They spent millions of dollars marketing this drug. In 1996, they only had a revenue of around $48 million, but in just 4 years, in the year 2000, they had a revenue of almost $1.1 billion, making it a blockbuster drug. Now, Purdue Pharmaceuticals wasn't alone. It was other companies such as Teva Pharmaceuticals and Johnson & Johnson or Janssen that rallied together in this campaign of deception here in this country. And while Purdue may have lit the match that started a fire of addiction in our nation, it was companies such as Johnson & Johnson and Teva that helped to fan the flame. Now, what they did was they had to change the historical perception of how we saw these drugs. So what they did was they touted unsubstantiated benefits for the treatment of chronic non-cancer pain and lied about the risk of abuse and addiction for taking these drugs. And how they did this was through one paragraph. In 1980, physicians Dr. Porter and Jick released a one-paragraph letter to the editor in the New England Health Journal. Now, I just want to clarify from the get-go, this is not a study, this is not peer-reviewed, and this is not related to outpatient opioid prescribing. This was simply a survey of individuals who had been in hospitalized situations who had received these medications, and so it had nothing to do with chronic non-cancer pain. But this didn't stop pharmaceutical companies from lying, and in fact, lie was what they did. They lied and said that the risk of addiction is much less than 1% addictive. It was so successful that it was cited 824 times since it was published. And again, this is not a real study, and this will blow your mind here. These companies have actually never conducted a real study. So what they would do is they would go into doctors' offices and say, you should be prescribing opioids for chronic pain. They're safe. In fact, they're less than 1% addictive. And if you don't prescribe these, you're actually a bad doctor and you're suffering from opioid phobia. And do you not care about your patients? They would just lie. Even Dr. Herschel Jick himself said it does not speak to the level of addiction in outpatients who take these drugs for chronic pain. But the lies didn't stop there. They also lied on branded marketing and unbranded marketing. Now, what branded marketing is marketing when the drug's name and the company name is on it. However, unbranded marketing is when a drug is marketed as a class. So what pharmaceutical companies would do is market opioids just in general, and they would have key opinion leaders, or KOLs as we refer to them as, or medical associations, now known as front groups, to tout their propaganda and lies. So what they would do is they would maybe have a physician come and give a lecture, and they would fund it, and they would just give out the information that the company wanted them to share. However, doctors were receiving this and believing that it was the truth and that this was real scientific and medically based information, and so they believed that these drugs were safe to prescribe. And who wouldn't believe if they were presented this information to look like it was legitimate science? And the same thing with the medical associations and front groups. All they did was lie and was purely funded by Big Pharma as a way to tout their propaganda. Now, they also engaged in lobbying too, and they spent millions of dollars to ensure that no legislation or policies would be put in place to prevent them from their marketing campaign and from these drugs being prescribed for chronic non-cancer pain. And they, in fact, spent at a rate of 8 times more money than gun lobbyists do here in this country. But it doesn't stop there. So many of you know Johnson & Johnson as the baby shampoo company. However, what we really should know them as is the opium poppy company. For 34 years, Johnson & Johnson Pharmaceuticals owned 2 subsidiaries, Tasmanian Alkaloids and Noramco Inc. Now, Tasmanian Alkaloids was based in Tasmania, and they were the company that grew and cultivated the poppy plant that was later sent to Noramco Inc. and sold to them to be processed into the active pharmaceutical ingredient known as an API that went into the drug. Now, what an API does is it actually gives the effect of the drug, and so what Johnson & Johnson's subsidiaries were doing was creating the opium that went inside the drugs that companies such as Purdue and Teva and others as well sold. And in fact, Johnson & Johnson's subsidiaries anticipated the demand of oxycodone to be released into the market and created a mutant strand of poppy to make this demand called the Norman poppy. Ironic, I know, since the first trial against this company was in Norman, Oklahoma. Now, in fact, they were successful, and Johnson & Johnson's subsidiaries became the #1 supplier of narcotic APIs in the United States, the world's largest market. However, Johnson & Johnson ended up selling off these subsidiaries in 2016. So you're probably wondering, what all did this do? What did all of these companies create? Well, as you can see from the green line on this chart, they were successful. Opioid sales went up. But I want you to focus on the blue line and the red line. The blue line stands for how many individuals were admitted into treatment, and the red line stands for opioid deaths. And the facts here just simply do not lie. As the rate of prescribing goes up, so does death. So where does this leave us? Today, it's estimated that 4.5 million Americans are addicted to prescription opioids. 467,000 individuals are addicted to heroin, and 80% of these people started on prescription opioid drugs. In Oklahoma specifically, around 240,000 individuals are addicted to prescription drugs, meaning that is 8% of the population, making Oklahoma #1 in the nation. Now, these were people like you and I, who were simply going to their doctor to receive treatment for pain. They didn't think they were going to walk out of the doctor's office soon to become an addict. And so this brings me to my second point, the science behind addiction, and why it truly is a disease of the brain. So what happens when an individual takes opioids for a long enough period of time, as well as the right enough amount, they eventually become addicted and their brain chemistry changes. So what this does is, the best way I can describe this to you is, it's like eating a cheeseburger. So inside your brain, you have this thing called the reward center, and it sends out signals of pleasure and happiness. And that's actually a really good thing. So when I eat the cheeseburger, it sends out a signal saying, hey, this is good. I probably should eat again sometime. But what happens when you take a prescription opioid drug is it overtakes the reward center, and it will send out a signal that says, you don't just need to take this drug sometime, but you need to take it right now. And it takes over the reward center. And one of the questions we often ask people who are struggling with addiction is, why are they willing to displace everything in their lives in order to feed the addiction? Why will they abandon their families, their friends, their careers? Why will they steal, lie, cheat, and do whatever to chase and feed this addiction? And it's simple. It's because their brain has changed to where they associate the need with that drug for the same as survival. So how this works is, your brain is actually divided into two portions: the prefrontal cortex, which is the reasoning portion of the brain, and the limbic portion of the brain, which is the survival and instinctual portion of your brain. So what happens is, when you take prescription opioid drugs, it overtakes the limbic portion of the brain, and it makes your body believe that you have to have this drug in order to survive. And it makes you associate it with things such as food and water, but at such a heightened level that it is so intense. And when I learned about this, it changed my heart. Because for me, I couldn't understand why somebody couldn't just quit. And it's so much more complicated than that. And oftentimes, if you speak to somebody who is struggling with opioid addiction, they want to quit so badly, but they are fighting a chemical change in their brain. And so that is why somebody, even as good as Mother Teresa, if she is prescribed long enough and the right enough amount, she will become an addict too. It's not a character flaw, but it's a biological mechanism that transforms the chemistry of the brain. Now, if you're like me, after hearing about what Big Pharma did, as well as learning the science behind addiction, you probably want to do something to help, or at least I hope you do. And so that's what I want to encourage you all today. It is time that we set a new standard in how we fight opioid addiction. And so I've created a little acronym, and it stands for support, educate, and treat. And now bear with me, because I'm going to go out of order here for a minute. And I'm going to start first with educate. We have to educate. It is vital. In order to prevent more addiction in this country, we have to explain the effects of these drugs, and also to help people have empathy. Now, there are several organizations in this state already doing good work with this. Organizations such as FATE, Fighting Addiction Through Education, as well as the Austin Box No. 12 Foundation, are doing great work here to educate and fight opioid addiction. Now, my next point is, we have to treat. It is vital that we treat. Only 1 in 10 individuals struggling with addiction will ever receive treatment. And in fact, very few of these individuals will go to research-based proven treatment that actually works. So not only do we need to provide treatment facilities in this state, we have to provide ones that are going to work. And so it is vital that we advocate for more treatment facilities, because there are so many people doing great work in this state. We have people like Commissioner Terry White, who is advocating for Oklahomans on a day-to-day basis. But we simply do not have enough places to put people who are struggling with this disease. And lastly, I want to talk about support. It is vital that we support individuals who are struggling with opioid addiction. I just want you to think about something. When somebody is struggling with either an illness or a tragedy, or going through a really difficult situation in their life, what do? Do we ignore them? No. We rally around them. We pray for them. We have fundraisers for them. We do meal trains. We do all of these things to make sure that they know that they are valued, and that they are cared for, and that they are supported. But what do we do for the mother who just dropped her son off to rehab? What do we do for the individual who is fighting for their life against this illness? The answer is probably nothing. And I'm not here to point fingers at anyone because I am guilty of this too, but it is time that we treat this like what it is, a disease of the brain, and we have to support people. The American Cancer Society often says that they're fighting for more birthdays. And I'm here today and sharing this message with y'all because I want to fight for more birthdays and help people overcome this disease. Now I want to take it back to where I started. The things that I said at the beginning of this message were actual things that people, if you talk to somebody who struggles with opioid addiction, are said to them regularly. And I believe words are so powerful, and that life and death is in the power of the tongue, and what we say matters. And I want to be a person that speaks life and encouragement into somebody and not negativity. And so I want to speak directly to an individual who is struggling with opioid addiction. You aren't weak, but you are strong, and you are some of the biggest fighters that I know. You don't have a character flaw. It has nothing to do with how you were raised, but you are a precious and valued human being. And lastly, you're an overcomer, and you're not a lost cause, but you're worth fighting for. Thank you.